You are tuned to Radio Moscow. In addition to instructions earlier transmitted to stop construction work on installations in Cuba, the Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day state of tension in October of 1962, in which the United States, Cuba, and the Soviet Union stood in a nuclear standoff. The crisis is generally regarded as the moment in which the Cold War came closest to turning into a nuclear conflict. It was also a threat of mutual destruction between all parties involved, leading to the major international arms agreement that resolved the crisis. After a failed attempt by the U.S. to overthrow Fidel Castro from Cuba's seat of power in July of 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reached a secret agreement with Cuban Premier Fidel Castro to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter any future invasion attempt. The constructions that took place during the summer of '62 went unnoticed by the U.S. government, due to the focus on planning Operation Mongoose, a plan headed by President Eisenhower in 1960. Which was then taken over by President Kennedy in 1961, which was the American effort to remove communist powers from authority in Cuba. However, Kennedy was soon aware of the constructions of missile bases in San Cristobal, Cuba, having received photographic proof of the bases on October 12th of 1962, and taking the next few days to discuss what to do with his cabinet, marking the start of the missile crisis on October 16th.
On October 22nd, after much discussion with the officials on his board, John F. Kennedy declared a naval quarantine around Cuba. For the American officials, the urgency of the situation stemmed from the fact that the nuclear-armed Cuban missiles were being installed so close to the U.S. mainland, just 90 miles south of Florida. He then sent the first of many direct and indirect letters to Nikita Khrushchev, declaring the U.S.'s opposals to weapons being shipped into Cuba, and demanded that the Soviet Union dismantle the bases. On the same day, John F. Kennedy released a public message on the state of affairs of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
On October 24th, Khrushchev responded, saying that Kennedy's blockade was an act of aggression, and all ships from the Soviet Union would proceed. The quarantine inspired a few Soviet ships to turn back, and stopped a few of the ships that would continue coming into Cuba, but none of those carried any weapons and were allowed to pass. On October 26th, Kennedy informed his advisors that it seemed that only an attack from the U.S. would remove the missiles, but he planned to give the diplomatic channel a bit more time. The crisis was at a stalemate. Then, Kennedy receives a message from Khrushchev sent at midnight in Russian time, with an emotional statement declaring the Soviet want for peace.
Let us therefore show statement-like wisdom. I propose you would declare that the United States will not invade Cuba with its forces and will not support any sort of forces which might intend to carry out an invasion of Cuba. Then, the necessity for the presence of our military specialists in Cuba would disappear.
Although the American government was convinced that this letter was authentic, the hope for peace was very short-lived. The next day, Khrushchev sent a second letter, demanding that in addition to not invading Cuba, the U.S. would remove the Jupiter missiles that they had in Turkey. At the same time, a U-2 spy plane pilot was shot down and killed over Cuba. In the midst of this chaotic tension, the president and his board made the decision to ignore the second letter sent by Khrushchev and replied in agreement with the terms of the first. Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, then secretly met with the Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrinin, and indicated that the United States was planning to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey anyway, and that it would do so soon, but this would not be part of any public resolution of the missile crisis. The next morning, on October 28th, Khrushchev issued a public statement that Soviet missiles would be dismantled and then removed from Cuba, marking the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis.